This is Committable. I'm Jesse Mangan, and in this episode, I reunite with independent journalist Leah Harris as we continue our series on involuntary outpatient commitments. And in this episode, we're talking about the concept of forcewashing, a term that Leah coined in an article about an involuntary outpatient commitment bill currently being considered in Massachusetts. And our conversation started with the question, what is forcewashing, and why do we need a term for this concept?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jesse. Good to be back. So, I really was trying to wrap my head around the fact that when I was looking at the involuntary outpatient commitment legislation that's currently in Massachusetts, I was looking at past versions of the legislation, and I noticed that over time, any reference to this being court ordered or even using that euphemized, right, assisted outpatient treatment, that over time, that language was stripped out of the bill. And so it's really now just kind of referring to critical services, right, which could mean anything. And so that really just got me thinking that force washing is really talking about ways that force and coercion within a given policy are literally hidden, such as in the case of Massachusetts, or straight up lied about. And I think this is my opinion that it's an attempt to sell it or make it more palatable to the public and to policymakers who may not really understand everything at stake. So it's related to the term care washing, right? Which is hiding things under the banner of compassion. And this is a term that has been talked about by the folks at Death Panel. But force washing to me is definitely related to that, but it's actually not just misrepresenting something, but actually hiding or lying about the force altogether.
So one of the things I find really interesting about this concept is that you seem to have traced it back decades. And one of the first instances of something that could be referred to as force washing is the phrase dying with their rights on. So what is that phrase and where does it come from?
Absolutely. So in the early 70s, you've covered this, Jesse, and I've been researching this for a long time. There was what was called a due process revolution in the law, which basically created the first ever kind of procedural norms for folks facing civil commitment, in the ways that they would theoretically in the criminal and justice system. So, now you have these policies and procedures and safeguards and standards, and a lot of people didn't like that. And so, very soon after these laws are passed, really kind of originated in Wisconsin with Lessard versus Schmidt. There was a Wisconsin psychiatrist whose name was Daryl Treffert. And he was also the superintendent at Winnebago State Hospital for many years. A lot I could say about Dr. Treffert, but he was the one to really come up with this idea of dying with their rights on. And he also came up with this rhetorical strategy, which we can trace a continuous line from the early 70s to now, where you take a rare tragedy or an instance where somebody with a psychiatric disability dies for whatever reason and say, oh, see, if we didn't have these stringent standards, that person would be alive or that tragedy would have been averted. So it's kind of viewing involuntary commitment as this panacea to things like death and violence in our society.
Yeah, to suggest that acknowledging basic due process rights leads to death, or that allowing people to have civil rights is tragic and lethal, that suggestion is inherently problematic and offensive. But it also seems to suggest that after basic due process rights were acknowledged, no one could be detained inpatient, which is easily demonstrably untrue. It's a false premise that sort of props up the myths around deinstitutionalization. But it's also a myth that was picked up and championed by people like E. Fuller Torrey. the founder of the Treatment Advocacy Center. And I wanted to play a clip from an interview with Dr. Torrey to help illustrate how this sort of force washing became integral to expanding commitment laws throughout the country.
The one thing that nobody had tried to affect was the laws. That the Civil Liberties Group had changed the laws in virtually every state to make it almost impossible to treat patients. And it was clear, as long as the laws were written and used as they were, that trying to get treatment, as families were learning, for their mentally ill family member was exceedingly difficult if the person did not accept voluntary treatment. So that's where the idea came from, is, okay, let's see if we can change the laws and push back a little bit. And that was the origin of the Treatment Advocacy Center.
That was E. Fuller Torrey talking about the mission and impacts of the Treatment Advocacy Center. And there are several things that stood out to me in that clip. One being the claim that no one before TAC had ever tried to change the laws.
It's very interesting how this is phrased, in that, no one had tried changing the laws, because from the moment the laws were passed, people were trying to change the laws. I think what happened here is a funder read Torrey's book and said, let's fund this legislative blitz. I think that's probably what made the difference versus, disparate efforts here and there to try to change the law. That literally had been occurring. Dr. Thomas Zander talks at length about efforts to, really make Lessard versus Schmidt kind of toothless over the years, and that he was constantly pushing back just to have it even properly implemented. So this is a very disingenuous and hyperbolic claim that he came up with this idea.
So there's the misrepresentation that no one had tried to change the laws. And another element that seems demonstrably untrue is that it became nearly impossible to force someone inpatient under those new laws. And I think we're going back to the myths around deinstitutionalization, the illusion that there was a point in our country's history where involuntary hospitalizations and civil commitments stopped.
Correct. Yeah. Involuntary commitment has always existed, will exist unless we totally overhaul the system as we know it. And one could argue that maybe there were some more procedural norms and standards in place on the books. But as we know, in practice, these hearings are often kangaroo hearings. The person themselves often doesn't even have a voice in these hearings. And that's been consistent. Unless you have a really skilled lawyer who gets it and will fight for you, most of the time, right, people are struggling to fight involuntary commitments without that kind of legal support.
And I think it's worth acknowledging that although there is some passionate opposition to the existence of these very, very basic due process standards, all that those standards are establishing, essentially, is that the person going through this process is a person, and they deserve to be afforded all of the same basic rights as everyone else.
Precisely. And I think ultimately what it comes down to is there's a real desire to take us back to the pre-deinstitutionalization norms, right? Which they're not so different post, but back then it was kind of like anyone who said, we think this is good for you, that was enough, right? It was even less of a pretense of any kind of due process. So I really do think that the end game here with all of this force washing is to kind of quietly take us back to those norms, whereas the state acted as a, quote, benevolent parent.
So we've talked a bit about this evolution, where you have Dr. Treffert in the 70s. He creates the dehumanizing phrase, dying with their rights on. And then you see Dr. Torrey in the 90s creating the Treatment Advocacy Center and sort of supercharging the illusion that it was nearly impossible to force people inpatient. And there's a quote that we found very recently from another psychiatrist, Jeffrey Lieberman, saying something almost identical. And this is the quote: The rules for civil commitment or treatment of a patient over objection or hospitalizing them over objection are so stringent that a person has to literally commit a crime before they can be forcibly admitted to the hospital or required to take medication. And what I wanted to highlight about that quote is not only that it shows the continued use of this concept and how it is integrated into the erosion of human rights. And in that quote, he was referencing something that happened in California, which is a state that has dramatically expanded their systems of commitment in recent years.
Yeah, we have in California Laura's Law that's been around. I don't remember precisely how long, since the 90s, I want to say, or early 2000s. Then that wasn't enough, apparently. So then they had to create care courts on top of that. They had to reform Lanterman Petrus Short, which now makes it much easier to force someone into a guardianship. There are layers and regimes of force in California. And there's also all kinds of laws when someone thinks there's an imminent risk of something. All of these things are on the books. And so again, I think it's all demonstrably false, and again, sort of used to really try to push us back to the 1960s.
I've been trying to think of a way to explain the semantic gymnastics that some people go through to claim it's not force. Because often when I'm saying this is forced, what I'm referring to is the threat of force. Because an outpatient commitment court order is saying to someone, do this or else. And the or else could be getting dragged into court or being detained in an emergency department or being strapped down and forced into a psych ward. So is it really a choice when the alternative is that or else? And I think this co-optation of language and rebranding of force bleeds into the mindsets of not only law enforcement, legislators, judges, and attorneys, but also clinicians. And we saw an illustration of that in the legislative hearing in Massachusetts, where a psychiatrist who said they were actively working in an emergency department and calling into the hearing during their shift at that emergency department, that psychiatrist said that they support the outpatient commitment bill because there were people in their ED right at that very moment who should be put on a court order, because the court order is how they will get care in the community. And I heard that and I thought, this is exactly why I'm afraid to go to the emergency department, afraid of seeking any type of treatment, because of these misrepresentations and this sort of conceptual shell game where force is hidden under the veneer of compassion. And for a lot of people in positions of authority, they have internalized these narratives so much that they view court order as synonymous with care.
Yeah, precisely. It's so absurd to me, right? Because these very policies steal from voluntary community supports, right? So because people, often just can't access any kind of support that they want until they're in a state, right, where they're maybe drawing public attention, and then a cop brings them into the emergency room. But all of these layers of force and coercion are literally thieving from the voluntary community system, right? There's only a finite pocket of money that exists, right? We can't sort of create funding out of the air. So it's like they are attempting to address the flaws of the system by stealing from the system, by siphoning from the system, and slapping a court on top of it. It's truly frightening. And I agree with you. I mean, this is why so many of us will not engage with these services unless we have to. And then even people who want to engage with these services often cannot access them. So that all of these things are going on, and it does frighten me how many champions of handing out court orders there are, within our systems.
That's a really powerful statement, that these involuntary outpatient commitment laws are thieving resources from people. And to try and illustrate the relevance of that statement, I think we can break outpatient commitment laws throughout the country into two basic categories: those that have funding attached and those that don't. And when an outpatient commitment law doesn't have funding attached, then often there is a mechanism in that law that says that if a county is perceived as failing to deliver the court-ordered treatment, then the courts will fine the county. The county will have to pay. And I believe with the bill in Massachusetts, it's $1,000 a day if the requirements of the court order aren't provided to the person being forced to accept them. So the county is being compelled by the state to divert resources away from people who are voluntarily seeking them. The county has to take those voluntary resources away from the people who want them and force those resources onto the person targeted by the court order.
Yeah, it is beyond absurd. It truly does not make sense. And that's why I say all of this falls apart the closer you look at it, right? There's the smoke and mirrors and the rhetoric on the surface, but then when you really dig down to how does this work? And I think the best illustration of this right now is Maryland, right? Who just had an AOT law rammed through in 2024 because the governor insisted on it. And the counties are like, yeah, we don't have any funding to do what you're telling us to do. So it's on hold. It's on hold. And I also just want to say, like, even if AOT and all of like the force system was funded to the hilt, like that's not what I'm arguing for. I'm just arguing that this is right, again, siphoning resources from already under-resourced systems, and the counties simply can't implement it. You can't implement a policy based on thin air.
So we've talked about the history and evolution of force washing. And I wanted to connect that to another theme that you've highlighted before, which is modernization, specifically using the language of modernization in order to sell the expansion of commitment laws. Can you talk a little bit about this idea of modernization and how it applies to policies of coercion and force?
Absolutely. So again, this is just another example of the upside down language or the upside down universe of these folks, right? To say, for example, in the case of the Lanterman-Petrus Short Act in California, often called LPS, there were efforts to reform that, quote unquote, and the efforts were continually referred to as modernization, right? So, oh, this is a really old law, like we need to fix it, which is absolute BS. They're actually regressing. I mean, if you, I don't really have like strong views of progress, right, in this day and age, but yeah, it's truly regressive. And then it was also echoed in the Gavin Newsom newsroom where they were announcing these reforms. And the headline was, quote, modernizing conservatorship law to better help and protect Californians most in need of care, right? So it's, these terms are leveraged over and over again, that we are modernizing it, which implies we're making it better. This is progress when we are actually going back, right? Who cares if LPS is a 50-year-old law, right? Just because a law is old doesn't mean that it has to be modernized. Roe versus Wade, is also about that old, right? And is clearly, being dismantled as we speak. But yeah, to use this language of modernization is totally bonkers. And then even if they don't necessarily call it modernization, there's this kind of language that we've heard, in the last few years in particular. Like, so in Maryland, when they were trying to sell the assisted outpatient treatment law, it was kind of like, oh, we're only one of 3 states that don't have this. Like, look how behind we are with all of these other states, right? And they are also, I've heard the same kind of rhetoric kind of leveraged in Massachusetts as well. Like, oh, we're one of only 2 states, let alone like Maryland, they're not even implementing it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just so wild.
Yeah, and one of the things that is truly lost in all of this is that there are things that we should be talking about. Really important conversations that we can't actually get to because we have to constantly peel back all of these layers of deception. And one thing that we should really be talking about and focusing on is how unreliable the commitment process is. If you think that someone who is genuinely in some sort of acute crisis was not hospitalized when they should have been, then a question that should be asked is, was that evaluation reliable? And the same question should be applied when someone is hospitalized unnecessarily, hospitalized and harmed by that process. Was that evaluation reliable? Those are conversations that could be actually productive. But instead, what we get is the continued erosion of due process rights being spun as a form of modernization when what would actually be progress on these issues is publicly engaging with questions like, are these processes reliably safe? And are these processes reliably effective?
Exactly. Yeah. And the answer's no. No, they are not. Right. This is all enormously subjective. All of it. Absolutely all of it. Right. Even down to who determines if someone is, quote, gravely disabled. Right. Like, let's say you come into the appointment, you didn't brush your hair, and there's like a coffee stain on your shirt. You're having a bad day. Right. Like, somebody could look at you and say, this person's unable to care for their basic needs. Right. And just understanding that there's so many levels and layers of power that can be exercised over folks who have certain psychiatric disabilities or use drugs, that I think again, like these ideas of choice and these ideas that the system, it's overall working. We just need to do this tweak so that these folks who fall through the cracks get help. Like, it's really just, I always say, slapping a layer of force onto a system that's already filled with force. It's just adding more and adding more layers of bureaucracy. And I think just for people to really understand, no matter how this is being sold, the songs, the dances, the smoke and mirrors, this is a form of psychiatric probation. Right? Multiple people have said this over the years, right? You talked about it with Fern. And it's like, if we just say that this is what this is and keep saying it, maybe we need to employ those tactics as well, because I think it's so important to parse the arguments, but in the end, just to remember that these are efforts to bring us back to the pre-deinstitutionalization norms, right? Where almost anyone could be locked up for almost any reason, often for life, right? This is the end game. And I truly believe that, despite what is being said.
So I want to attempt something new for the podcast, a sort of lightning round, where I'll mention a few different narratives, a few different talking points, statements that people attach to involuntary outpatient commitments. And then after each talking point that I mention, you can share whatever thoughts come to mind. And first talking point: assisted outpatient treatment gives people rights.
Right. Again, this is just an example of how the language that is used to sell this morphs over time, right? They anticipate what opponents are going to say. They're trying to preemptively respond to this is taking away people's civil rights. No, it's not. It's giving them civil rights. It's almost as if you repeat things often enough, they become the truth, which is a unfortunate propaganda tip that comes from it's attributed to Goebbels, but we won't we won't spend too much time on that. But it really is the repetition, right, of, oh no, this is giving people rights because it's giving them the capacity to exercise their rights. This is a crock because, if there was a real interest in supporting people, to exercise their rights, to exercise their legal capacity, there's all kinds of mechanisms to do that without force, right? There's shared decision making, supported decision making. These are all well-established ways of really, supporting people to maintain their agency, even if they may kind of experience altered states that are called psychosis, right? There are still ways to work collaboratively with a person. So yeah, again, it's just it's a way to force wash and make it sound like, oh no, we're not doing what we're being accused of. Yes, you absolutely are.
Yeah, when you create a court order designed to limit someone's options, to force them into a system of surveillance that regulates their autonomy, that is inherently infringing on that person's rights. Their right to privacy, their right to bodily autonomy, and that needs to be acknowledged. Any legislator considering this sort of bill needs to understand that.
Yeah, it's just a way again to force wash, and it is a lie, really, is what it is. It's a straight up fabrication.
Okay, second lightning round statement. No one will ever be sent inpatient just because they didn't comply with the AOT court order.
Again, just because you say a thing a lot doesn't make that thing true. And if people just took 5 minutes to examine implementation elsewhere, who do they think is picking people up? We literally have a documentary that is called Crazy. And I encourage anyone who thinks this is a good thing to watch that documentary. Because yes, indeed, when this person who's the subject of this film is found to be violating the order, police do show up at the door, right? And if this thing is unenforceable, then why are you promoting it? Like it's such, again, falls apart when you examine it. And I just defy people to look at implementation data in other states. It's of course spotty, it's not the same everywhere. But absolutely cops are picking people up, taking them to the hospital, sometimes over and over and over during the course of an AOT order.
Yeah, New York State is often presented as a sort of shining example of AOT success, but there was recently a comptroller audit of Kendra's law, the assisted outpatient treatment law in New York, and the audit found that significant events weren't reliably being reported. And the incident that was highlighted to demonstrate why this is such a serious concern was a person on an AOT court order was hospitalized 33 times. They were on an outpatient commitment order, hospitalized 33 times, then died by suicide. And none of those hospitalizations were reported. So the system is being given the ability to diminish what happens to people on these court orders, because if you don't report it, the system can pretend it didn't happen, which I think kind of leads us into lightning round statement number 3. AOT doesn't force medication.
I would say this is like obfuscation at best and disinformation at worst. Because again, all you need to do is take 5 to 10 minutes and look at the implementation data elsewhere, right? I don't know if Massachusetts is just going to be this like wild exception where you have a court order that doesn't force medication as part of the court ordered treatment plan. Maybe they're going to be the only one. But like, look at just New York data. I mean, this is going back, I've been looking at this since the mid 2000s, but okay, let's take it from 2024 if you don't want to go on old data. 2024 indicates 99% of active AOT participants had medication on their treatment plans. 86% of them specifically receiving long-acting injectable antipsychotic medications. I don't have access to all the data everywhere, but I really can't imagine these numbers are radically different. And then again, to say, to kind of quibble with certain aspects of the law, like, well, medication over objection is not what we're doing. If your choice is follow this treatment plan that includes medication or go to jail or the psych ward, you're going to say, yes, I will. You're not going to continue to say no. So they aren't medicating you over objection. It's just hiding the layers and layers of force and fear and coercion. and lying. They lie to people all the time and say, you have to take this medication in order to get out of the hospital. And I'm sure they're lying about it in terms of AOT, like, oh, you have to accept medication as part of this, right? It just, people are lied to consistently within these systems. It's just repeating something over and over again and just hoping that it will stick and that policymakers will bite at it.
This raises a serious concern in relation to the proposal in Massachusetts because there is no requirement that any judge, clinician, or attorney actually ask the person what works for them. And so, in regards to the semantic dance of like, does the threat of force count as force? Does it really count as treatment over objection? I guess it's a lot easier to say that it isn't treatment over objection if you never ask the person whether or not they object.
We go so deeply into a dystopian universe. Like, I strain to like understand our human and civil rights are not up for debate. People want to debate them and they want to push back on them, but it's like they want to continually have folks dancing around semantics. And I just think it's really important to just have a clear stance, right? That yes, mechanisms for force exist in our society, whether we like it or not, right? That already exists. But to say that to expand that is a breach of human and civil rights. And if you're against human and civil rights, that tells me everything I need to know about you. It's like, no, if you wanted to work collaboratively with a person, you could. You just don't want to. And so this is why we are where we are.
As we bring this episode to a close, is there anything else related to force washing or involuntary outpatient commitments that you think is important for people to know?
Yeah, I think just to really pay attention to the media narratives when bad things happen, right? And how those terrible events, those tragic events, I'm thinking specifically of the Reiner family's tragedy, how those are leveraged to say, oh, if we had had more force, this terrible thing wouldn't have happened, right? And I think to really like just pay attention to that because it happens every single time, and it's just used to again increase the capacity of the state's power over people's bodily autonomy and lives. So I find it profoundly disturbing. And so I think, yeah, calling a thing what it is, really shunning the euphemisms, pushing back, rejecting them when you hear them. I think that that's all a really important part of resisting these efforts that are care washed and force washed, and people are being straight up lied to.
That was my conversation with independent journalist Leah Harris about the concept of force washing, the practice of using manipulation, misinformation, and obfuscation to rebrand the use of force as a benevolent intervention. And in the next episode of this series, I speak with someone who has experience navigating involuntary outpatient commitment laws from multiple different perspectives, as an advocate, as an attorney, and as a parent. That's next time on Committable.